Well, good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be sharing some thoughts about the Apostle Paul, which I hope you'll enjoy as well. We're going to begin by just showing some pictures of the places that were visited by the Apostle Paul. And here we are outside Damascus, approximately where Paul was converted, and here's a street called Straight, still called Straight. And there are the houses in the walls of the old city, and there is Paul being lowered down a wall in a basket. And now we are at the city of Perga in southern Turkey today. And here we are at Yalvac, Pisidian Antioch, the aqueduct that brought water to the city. An inscription with the name Sergius Paulus indicates the truth of the message of the book of Acts, and there is the Ignatian way that passes through Ephesus and the stream in which Lydia was almost certainly baptised, and there is the traditional site of the prison of Paul in the city of Ephesus. There are large tracts of Paul's life that we really don't know too much about. For example, about 15 years in Jerusalem. We know he was there, we know broadly what he was doing, but we don't know if his family was with him or much about what he was doing. Similarly, when he went back to his native province of Syria, Cilicia, for a decade or so, again, we have very little information about him. It's when his journeys are documented by the book of Acts and illustrated by his own letters that we have much more information about Paul. Let me, though, share some of the opinions about Paul that have been held. A prominent British scholar, James Dunn, said of Paul, it was Paul more than any other person who ensured that the new movement stemming from Jesus would become a truly international and truly intellectually coherent religion. He's an eminent scholar, and his views are worth noting. Equally eminent was the late Professor Martin Hengel of Tübingen in Germany, arguably the greatest biblical scholar of the 20th century. He said Paul's mission was unique in the ancient world and an unprecedented happening in terms both of the history of religion in antiquity and of later church history. And that as a result of what he did, Paul has remained unparalleled in the subsequent 1900 years. The philosopher Anthony Flew said Paul was a first-class intellectual who had a brilliant philosophical mind. And quite recently, the Oxford scholar Larry Siddentop actually attributed to Paul the invention of the notion of the individual and therefore of human rights. I think it's safe to say that there is a growing appreciation of the legacy of Paul to Western civilization. Named after Paul are whole cities, great cathedrals, university colleges, including within the city of Sydney. Paul, however, has had many critics. Mostly these are people who have admired Jesus, but disliked or even hated Paul. Most prominent among these was the German scholar William Rader, who wrote in 1906 that the real inventor of Christianity was not Jesus, but Paul, and not for the better. Rader, spelled W-R-E-D-E, has been followed by such distinguished persons as Mahatma Gandhi, Friedrich Nietzsche, Soren Kierkegaard, and the German biblical scholar Rudolf Bultmann. George Bernard Shaw was no admirer of Paul, and attributed to him the invention of what he called Christianity. And then quite some years ago, there was a movie called The Last Temptation of Christ, and that basically followed this idea that the one who hijacked Christianity as established by Jesus was Paul. The Last Temptation of Christ was a successful book by Kazantzakis, Greek scholar, and made into a popular Hollywood movie. There are many people who have preferred to see Jesus as a rabbi, a wise man, a wise teacher, a sage, but not as a redeemer. And certainly the people I've just quoted, like William Rader and Shaw and others, are happy to listen to Jesus, happy to take note of what he says, but they do not like Paul. However, Jesus himself said that he was a redeemer. In Mark chapter 10, for example, he said, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." There you are, the idea of redemption. And the Apostle Paul quotes traditions that he didn't write, which he received very soon after he became a Christian, which he quotes in the 1 Corinthian letter, "Christ died for our sins." There it is. That is a redemptive statement, which is apostolic. And since it would have been formulated immediately after the death and resurrection of Jesus, we must take it that would have been Jesus' own view himself. Similarly, Paul quotes the Lord's Supper tradition also in 1 Corinthians. "My body broken for you." This is my body broken for you. And the word "for" indicates redemption. So the attempt to separate Jesus into an acceptable part, namely a wise teacher and a redeemer, the attempt to separate the one from the other really won't stand up to serious scrutiny. Jesus truly was a wise teacher, but no less was he a redeemer. That is an absolute fundamental. I think it's always helpful to have a sense of chronology and sequence. People who know about real estate say it's a matter of location, location, location. Well, when it comes to a study of someone like Paul, it's chronology, chronology, chronology. And if you establish a chronology, you can then begin to establish context and matters like that. And you are gradually able to form an opinion about a person or an event. So let me share with you some chronological data about Paul. As I say, we don't have a complete picture, but we do have an extensive picture at certain points. I guess the biggest question about chronology in Paul is we simply do not know the year of his birth. He doesn't indicate anything about that in his letters. And there are only two hints that come out of the book of Acts. One is the book of Acts describes Saul of Tarsus, as he was then referred to, at the time of the killing of Stephen, describes Saul as a young man. Well, that doesn't go very far to helping us. Certainly indicates he's not a youth, but he's not middle-aged, so he's somewhere in the 20s, one would imagine. Another hint comes from the fact that the chief priest, the high priest, I should say, appointed Paul, gave Paul the authority to go to Damascus and capture the disciples who had fled there. Now, in Jewish thought, a person was fit for authority or administration or something similar to that at age 30. So, in about the year 34 or so, Paul would have been about 30 by that reckoning. So it's a bit rough and ready, but my best guess is that Paul was born about AD 5. That would have made him younger than Jesus by 10 years, and probably younger than some of the original 12 who followed Jesus. We're on firmer ground when we have to think about the other extremity of Paul's life, namely his death. Almost certainly that was in the middle 60s. So that happened in Rome. He would have been executed probably by beheading, and because he was a Roman citizen, he would not have been crucified. So Paul's life, therefore, AD 5 to 65, he had 60 years. I must say, I find that a little curious. He seems to have achieved a great deal for a man of only 60 years behind him. Let me think with us now about the first part of Paul's life, the pre-Christian Paul, which goes from about 5 to 34. That means that Paul's life was divided into two fairly neatly even parts. He became a Christian in about his 30th year, and then he remained a Christian for approximately 30 years. I think one of the things that I hope to bring out from these discussions about Paul is just how much he achieved in those 3 decades, especially when we understand that the last part of that 30 years was spent in prison. So the pre-Christian Paul, therefore, first of all, he is in Tarsus from about AD 5 to AD 17. He's from a strict Jewish family. His father was a Roman citizen, something that Paul inherited. Most probably he was educated by private tutors at home rather than at school. You don't have the impression of him being exposed to Greek thought so much as to Jewish thought as mediated through the Old Testament, the Greek version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. So Paul was fluent in Greek. He wrote good quality Greek with few, if any, mistakes in the grammatical sense. So by birth, he's a Roman citizen. He's also a citizen of the city of Tarsus. And so we associate wealth and privilege with this man. We know from later on that he worked as a tent maker. And it's quite possible that he learnt that trade in his boyhood. And there is a speculation that his father was a manufacturer of tents, which, so the speculation goes, he actually provided for Roman armies in that area, and that may have been the reason why he was given Roman citizenship, because of the favours or the relationship that Paul's father had established with influential Roman people. So from AD 5 to AD 17, he's in this city of Tarsus, which is a second-class city, really. It's a satellite of the great city of Antioch, which was the third biggest city in the world at that time: Rome, Alexandria, Antioch. And so Tarsus is like the poor sister of the great city of Antioch. In his early teens, it would appear. He relocated to Jerusalem from AD 17 to 34. So for about 17 years he's in Jerusalem. We know that he was a star pupil of Gamaliel, the leading rabbi of the day. We expect that he had further exposure to the Greek Old Testament. And it's good to be reminded that Jerusalem at that time was even regarded as a Greek city. A majority of funerary inscriptions in Jerusalem at that time were in Greek, which comes as a bit of a surprise. We would have expected Jerusalem to have been an exclusively Jewish city, but it was not. Anyway, Paul commended himself sufficiently to the temple authorities that he became the hatchet man who attacked the Christians in the city of Jerusalem, and then to Damascus to extradite the fleeing disciples. Then we come to the turning point in Paul's life, which happened at Damascus. And so we now move to the years that we call the Christian Paul as opposed to the pre-Christian Paul. When we think about the information that Paul provides, it becomes quite clear when we think about it that Paul is not the inventor of Christianity, but he is the innovative applier of teachings which he didn't formulate. There are three sources of information that I just might share here. One is, outside Damascus, the risen Lord Jesus confronted Paul, and through that confrontation, Paul, I think, immediately came to understand certain things. That the crucified Jesus had been glorified by God and taken up into heaven. I think that was a big thing, and that Paul, therefore, had made the most dreadful mistake in attempting to wipe out the people that Jesus called to himself. So the notion of apocalypsis or revelation is absolutely fundamental to the changing of the major ideas about Jesus in the mind of Paul. But secondly, there is also what is called the tradition, in Greek, the paradosis, that Paul said he received from the disciples and apostles before him. We know, for example, that on return from Damascus, he spent 15 days in the house of Simon Peter. And so he would have received numerous teachings and understandings of the words of Jesus from Peter, and probably also from James, the brother of the Lord, whom he also met on that return from Damascus to Jerusalem. And there is a third source, that is, from the sources that went on to become part of the Gospels. An early version of Mark's Gospel, which Paul seems to know and make reference to in Romans 14. The so-called sources underlying the Synoptic Gospels, known as Q, L, and M. Paul is familiar with these. We don't know exactly when he received them. So there are three sources of information that feed into Paul. There is the revelation from heaven, from Jesus. There is the tradition that he learned at the feet, as it were, of the apostles before him. And then there were these growing bodies of source material which would go on to become part of the main four Gospels. So, careful thought, therefore, eliminates the idea that Paul is a kind of maverick who has significantly departed from Jesus and gone on and done his own thing, as it were. That is That is not the case. Paul, throughout his ministry, remains incredibly humble in respect of the teachings of the Lord, of his master. He's not a maverick. He's not a tearaway. In respect to the Christian message, Paul is not an arrogant man. In fact, he is a very humble man. The Christian Paul, from 34 to 65, really was the creator of a new form of communication and education, namely the creation of the letter. Of course, letters were very commonplace in terms of personal information and administrative detail and so on, but they're mostly quite short. Paul, however, creates a letter, some of which could be as short as Philemon, just 30 or so verses, or something as lengthy as the letter to the Romans, which is a tightly argued, rather lengthy message. But Paul was the ingenious, as it were, innovator in respect of this means of communication by means of letters. Very often Paul's letters have a co-author or co-sender. I think Timothy, his special friend, if you could call him that, I think he shared in no less than 6 of Paul's letters that he, as it were, helped write. And then there were the envoys, the trusted servants of Paul, or friends of Paul, we should say, who actually took the letters from Paul to the churches in question. And almost certainly these envoys had a major role in terms of not only reading the letter, probably quite slowly, explaining the letter as they went along, fielding questions and so on. So we know of several of these envoys. One was a guy called Tychicus, which means something like lucky. That suggests that he was not a Jew, but a Gentile and who had become a Christian. The other envoy, of course, was the woman Phoebe, a wealthy woman from a daughter church of Corinth called Cenchrea. Probably with companions, she travelled from Corinth to Rome, quite a lengthy journey, and she would have found the Christians in the city and almost certainly would have read the letter to them and explained it as she went along. So let me just say something now about Paul and his letters. First of all, in his period from Damascus, Arabia, Damascus, period of about 3 years, we have no letters from that period. He goes to Jerusalem in about 37. Again, there are no letters. Then he goes back to his native Tarsus, Syria and Cilicia, for 9 or 10 years. We know that he founds churches while he is there. Book of Acts makes that clear. But there are no letters. Then he begins to travel in a westward direction towards Rome to bring the gospel to that great city. He goes to the so-called Galatian area through Cyprus and Pisidia and like Ionia. And when he returns to Antioch, he then writes the letter to the Galatians, almost certainly Paul's earliest letter, written in about the year AD 48. Then he engages in a mission in Macedonia and Achaia, that is in the whole of Greece, from 50 to 52. And from Corinth he writes 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Then he has a mission in Asia, Roman Asia, for 53 to 56, where he writes most of his letters. He writes Ephesians from Ephesus, which is a bit curious, but probably there were a string of house churches in Ephesus, and he writes this important letter to them. It's a kind of a circular letter. He writes to the Colossians from Ephesus. He writes to Philemon from Ephesus. And he writes 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. So Ephesus, where he spent about 3 years, was a major place for ministry for Paul, but he was also very productive as a letter writer from that city of Ephesus. Then engages in a mission in Macedonia, followed by 3 months or so in the city of Corinth. And from Berea, almost certainly, he writes 2 Corinthians, and from Corinth he writes his great letter to the Romans. Then he's in prison in Rome from 57 to 62. And there he writes the Philippians and also the first letter of Timothy, or to Timothy. He's released and then re-imprisoned and then faces execution, and he writes a second letter to Timothy. So there's some debate about exactly when and where these letters were written and when and where Paul was doing this and that. But that's a fairly conservative and I think not too difficult to defend as an idea of the ministry of Paul.